Welcome to another edition of Who's Better Baseball. A lot happening in the game right now. Patrick, we got to start off today with some sad news, though. For the second time in the last 3-4 years here, uh, one of the best players in the game goes down with an ACL. Is it the other one for Ronald Acuna Jr.? Was it originally the left and now it's the right? Um, I'm not exactly sure on that one, but that's the biggest story in sports right now, and that's where we're gonna have to open up the show today because to see Acuna go down with the same injury after just getting back and getting to the MVP level last year, it sucks. No matter who you follow and root for, even me as a Mets fan.
We will talk about the impact on Atlanta with Acuna Jr. being out for the season, but I certainly wasn't thinking that at first. It was just, oh man, a generational player done for the year, similar injury, and look, you need your legs to be able to do what Ronald Acuna Jr. does on a night in, night out basis. And we got a good decade or so of Mike Trout before, he just started recently breaking down, and he was already put together the Hall of Fame career that's going to get him to Cooperstown. And it's like, if we were talking about buying stock on whether or not Ronald Acuna Jr. makes it to Cooperstown, it's got to be a lot lower than it was this time yesterday because you do need to compile a little bit. You do need to have 7 dominant or so seasons to insert yourself into that conversation of, well, you weren't around that long, but while you were around, you dominated, and Acuna just feels like he's just short of that. So hopefully he can rebound from this and get his career back on track. Still young, 26 years old.
He's got time.
Yeah.
It's just insane that it happened again. And I am looking. I think it was the other knee. So now you just got to wonder, like moving forward. I think there was a big mental hurdle we saw Acuna go through when you look at what he did in 2022. The power wasn't quite there. He still stole 29 bases, but the following year, like he stole 73 bases, and we saw he was running without any fear. I mean, he was able to explode. Now that this has happened again, what type of mental toll does it take on Acuna when he finally gets back on the field? Because going through this again, it's now got to always be present in his mind whenever he's on a baseball field. This can happen to me. Just horrible. And whenever you see the non-contact injury in sports, it's almost never just a sprain. It's almost always this. And that was everyone's sort of worst fear when it first came out. And sure enough, it wasn't even 24 hours after it happened that we get the diagnosis that he's done.
Professional athletes are amazing what they can put their body through, or they can put their mind through to force their body to go through it. I mean, there's so many players. Think about, there was a time when Giancarlo Stanton's face got smashed in, getting hit by a pitch, and he's still out there in the batter's box, not shying away from a fastball up and in. Ryan Feltner last year took a line drive, had a fractured skull off the bat of Nick Castellanos, and he's out there now, not, shrinking away after every single pitch, worried about getting hit. So it's amazing that how these guys do that, and how many of them. I think we talked about it recently. Maybe it was in terms of Paul Skeens, where he just goes out there and is almost expecting he'll need Tommy John surgery at some point, but instead of protecting his body from the knife, right? You never want to have surgery of any kind. You want to be able to rehabilitate it somehow. But instead of protecting his body, he just goes in full force, and you just have to put that out of your mind. It's incredible.
It is. I mean, that's so it's a lot harder than people realize to be able to put your body out there like that. And even, Mike Trout this year, I saw Joe Adele on a podcast the other day talking about that injury. And I guess I didn't see it, but I guess there was some national media, Stephen A. Smith, that was questioning Mike Trout and saying that baseball players are soft and all this other stuff. But Joe Adele said that Mike Trout got hurt and he finished that game before ending up on the IL for an injury that's going to keep him out for months. I mean, to be able to play through things is just incredible. Last year, Francisco Lindor played through, I think it was like bone spurs in his elbow or something. We see that a lot with these guys where you find out later, oh, they're going through it, especially in baseball where these guys are in a marathon of a season playing every single day basically for 6 months. It's crazy the stuff that they play through and how they just do whatever they can to post up and get themselves in the lineup every day.
They definitely don't get the same credit that football players do, right? Was it maybe Ronnie Lott broke his finger and had it
like cut off or something.
I think he did. He had it cut off, right?
Yeah,
For
I
his
think he had
guy
it cut off and like went back into a playoff game or something. Yeah,
That's a
that
little bit extreme, but like, yeah,
yeah.
baseball players do that maybe to a slightly lesser degree. And I think it's surprising because it's, like you said, non-contact for Ronald Acuna Jr., but there isn't that same impact with football. But these guys are playing through it all the time and they don't talk about it. I don't think
No.
football players really do either. But I think maybe baseball players even less so, because could give the opponent a little bit of an advantage. And because you're playing 6-7 games a week, you're going to lose a couple. And as soon as you start talking about, well, I'm not feeling great or this, that, and the other, it sounds like an excuse. So you know what? You just kind of zip your lip, you play through the injury, and then all of a sudden, a guy's out for the rest of the year, and you didn't realize that he was playing banged up through the first quarter of the season plus.
A lot of times you'll see a player at the end of the season, the stats aren't great, and you have been wondering about it, and then all of a sudden you see like the off season, oh, you got a hip cleaned up or a knee, and you're like, oh, maybe that's why he was way worse than he's been throughout his career. So yeah, injuries are the worst. And now as we sort of turn the page on it for the Braves, how do they fill this void? I think in the short term, it's pretty simple. Adam Duvall and Jared Kelenic, who have been splitting time, are suddenly everyday guys. And you look at what they've done this year, neither one of them really jumps out. They're both sitting at about league average when it comes to their offense. So now you look at moving forward, those guys are going to be pushed out to the forefront. We were talking about who replaced them. And you said it was JP Martinez, which I said was like a creative player. I had no idea who that was that filled in, but the Braves are a team that likes to play their starters every single day. So I think in the short term, that's the answer. And you know that if any team tries to put a somewhat competent fourth outfielder through waivers at any point before the deadline, the Braves are going to be the first team looking to make a claim there to add some depth to that outfield, because it doesn't feel like they have a lot in the works here.
Brian Snitker is probably gonna have to manage maybe for the first time in his career, right? Doing a little mixing and matching. Could you possibly even see Travis d'Arnaud play some first base, or Sean Murphy, right? Keep their bats in the lineup if you want to DH for somebody else.
Could we see Ozuna get in the outfield again? I wouldn't have thought it, but now that you say that would be an option, right? When you get Sean Murphy back, you DH one of your catchers and you stick Ozuna in left field. I mean, it might be their best option at some points this season, honestly, even though I can't even tell you the last time Ozuna was out in the outfield. But then again, that's your best hitter who's killing it as a DH. So, do you want to take away from what he's doing so well and force him back into an outfield role? It's going to be tough for them to try to figure this out.
I agree with what you were saying about if someone gets designated for assignment, they can work a deal out or gets waived, right? Because there's only like two other position players, even on the 40-man roster, that Atlanta can tap into, because they've got, I think, 6 starters basically down in AAA Gwinnett. So they did call up JP Martinez, as you said, not to be confused with JD Martinez, who's Julio Daniel Martinez. This JP Martinez is Julio Pablo Martinez. And I'm sure Atlanta hopes that, he actually can be a knockoff version, if you will, of JD Martinez, because even still, that's going to have a lot of value, I think, for Atlanta. So a lot of weight resting on the shoulders of Kelenic and Duvall. And, while Atlanta's farm system, we've talked about this throughout the season, that, they've got all their biggest pieces locked up and extended long term. So their farm system maybe isn't as strong as it's been in the past, but they can still use a couple of those chips to bring in guys. And all you need is some veteran presence in a clubhouse like that. Look, it worked in 21, right? Bringing in, Jock Peterson, Adam Duvall, Eddie Rosario. There were 4 guys that they all brought in, and they meshed really well. And they could do that again without giving up some of their top prospects.
I think that's definitely the move. And there's a guy that I think would love to demand a release from his current team to go to the Braves, and that's Kevin Pillar. Kevin Pillar talked a lot about how much he loved being a Brave. And I bet you that's a guy that they wish that they could grab right now. And he's actually, looking at his stats, he's hitting 329 for the Angels right now with a 981 OPS, 5 home runs for Kevin Pillar and 79 at-bats. I doubt that's sustainable at 35 years old, but Kevin Pillar is a name that I'd watch out for at the deadline for the Braves, that sometimes they'd like to cycle back to some of their former players. We saw them do that with Adam Duvall, and I mean, I'm sure they're thrilled that they actually did make that signing at the 11th hour free agency, because now Duvall plays a huge role for them. But Kevin Pillar Tommy Pham. I mean, those veteran outfielders, like you said, that would be available at the deadline. It seems like that's where they're going to have to go. We were wondering, how would a team like the Braves like attack this deadline? What would they need to add? Well, now we know they definitely need to add a corner outfielder.
They absolutely do. And their lineup did, get a boost in the recent day where both Austin Riley and Sean Murphy are coming off the IL. So I think probably the strangest thing besides just subtracting Acuna from their lineup is the order, because you're used to seeing, that pop at the top there, right? And a one pitch leadoff home run gets the job done for Atlanta. And now, that's not there with Acuna Jr. You still got some pop, of course, with Ozzie Albies there. Austin Riley here on Memorial Day batting second, with Sean Murphy down in the lineup seventh. But it looks a little bit more human. It doesn't look pedestrian, but it looks a little bit, just above average, which I think for the Mets and the Rockies are two teams that we keep an eye on. We kill for something like that. But you got Albies, Riley, Ozuna, Olsen, and then it gets questionable with Orlando Arcia batting fifth today on Monday, Michael Harris the second, Murphy, Duvall, Kelenic. So still a solid lineup, but you'd rather have Acuna Jr. in there somewhere.
It looks a lot weaker for sure, and that really kind of brings me to where we're going to go next here, which is, are the Phillies now the clear favorite in the National League East? And the answer has to be yes. They've already been doing it throughout this season. I know if you want to be a hater, you want to poke holes in the Phillies, you can talk about their schedule. I'm not going to do that. Okay. When you have a team that's consistently winning series after series after series, didn't your Rockies actually snap like the first time they'd actually lost the series in like a month? Isn't that what just happened over the weekend here?
It was, I think it might have only been the second series that the Phillies had lost, which was to the Reds at that point. But yeah, Rockies take 2 of 3. They should have won on Saturday night. They had the lead going into the ninth. They gave up 5 runs in the top of the ninth. And this is their 4th time that they've given up 5 runs or more in the 9th inning or later. They're the only team in baseball that have done that. And they've done it 4 times, which now ties a modern era record. So if they do it one more time, no bullpen has ever done that before.
Wow.
That's besides the point. Phillies ended up coming back. And in fact, if it wasn't a short leash by number 120, if you know, number 120, ejecting Bryce Harper in the first inning of that game on Friday, that was incredibly close. I think the Phillies only lost by 1 run. You could have had a regular 2 out of 3 series win for the Phillies were it not for the ejection by home plate umpire Brian Walsh because of, a 3-letter word, not a 4-letter word, a 3-letter word. You can't say that to umps.
It's so ridiculous. I got a question, Patrick. I know you do some umping as well. Does that make your blood boil? Has there ever been like a coach that has said you to you and you have the quick hook and you throw him out?
No, not exactly. I give a little leeway where, we can have that conversation, like Bryce Harper said, with John Tumpane, Alan Porter, Vic Carapazzo, like running down the list of umpires who understand that you can have a little bit of a conversation and it's okay. But I guess 120 doesn't understand that. That was some shade. I thought that was really something by Harper there.
That's bad. Yeah. No, I mean, there was a bad ejection, and yeah, Harper, he handled that as far as a post game presser as good as you could. I think where we're clearly calling the guy out, but maybe not doing anything that'll get him fined or anything like that. I think that was a whole crazy situation. But looking at that Phillies team right now, I mean, man, even without Trey Turner, their lineup looks better than the Braves currently. And you're going to get Trey Turner back, and you have the best rotation potentially in baseball. I think it's pretty interesting that these two teams are now going to flip roles, basically. The last time we saw the Braves in an underdog role, it was 2021, and it's just simply because they didn't get off to the best start. The Mets were actually the team in first place, and it was really just a division that was wide open, and the Braves grabbed it, and they went on that run. This is a Braves team that's vulnerable, but who knows? Maybe being in an underdog role is something that will suit them more. And who knows? Maybe they'll, even if they don't win the division, maybe they'll find more postseason success this way.
Yeah, if you match up the injured players for the Phillies and Atlanta, as you said, Trey Turner on the IL, he should be back at some point. I think he was ramping up his running to 90%. But one thing manager Rob Thompson said before Friday's game was like, basically we're not rushing him back. We don't necessarily need him back at this point. So with the strained hamstring, obviously it's a long season, so they're going to take their time. But you got Ronald Acuna Jr. and Spencer Strider both done for the year for Atlanta, and Philly right now just as a 15-day IL stint. They've got Trey Turner and then Dylan Covey, Luis F. Ortiz, Junior Marte. Can I sell you a Junior Marte? I don't know what combination of Trey Turner and a random Phillies reliever you can combine, but it does not match Acuna Jr. and Spencer Strider. It doesn't match that loss. And so Philly's staying healthy as probably the biggest key for them, particularly that rotation. And it's been really good. Best rotation in the National League East. I think best rotation really in baseball so far. And I think that's going to continue. They still got some guys that they can go to down in the minors should they need some spot starts. So the Phillies definitely have of a lot of good mojo. And that was a good clubhouse. That was interesting going in there post game and seeing everyone sitting around eating, and they know the job that they got to get done because they've got it taken away from them the last couple years in the postseason, and they really believe that the regular season is their time to shine and say, we're gonna build up a lead, we're gonna build up a confidence, we're gonna build up this dominance so that when we get to the postseason, it immediately translates over so that we can go to that World Series. But it's almost as if every series now during the regular season is a smaller version of the World Series for them, so they can sort of callous themselves and harden the skin, if you will, to being good in those big spots and just winning at will.
They're going to have a chance here to prove that Brian Snitker is wrong about the whole, how it's the start of the playoffs being a disadvantage. Because I think at this point, I'd be very surprised if they don't end up being the winner of the National League East and getting that first round bye. And it'll be interesting to see if those two teams get to meet up again in the NLDS and what happens this time. One of the interesting parts when you talked about Acuna and Strider being out that struck me also, I mean, I don't know if they were the betting favorites for Cy Young and MVP, but they certainly were close to it at the beginning of this season. And it's almost another sort of feather in their cap as far as the fact of how good the Braves are, that we're not talking about them being done. We're talking about them not winning the division, but we still believe the Braves can win the World Series this year, and they lost their ace, a Cy Young candidate, and the reigning MVP, and they still have enough talent to win it all this year. That shows how good they are. Is it a lot harder? Has the margin of error gotten a lot smaller? Absolutely. But I'll tell you what, it really just shows how unbelievably stacked they are, that they still have Chris Sale, Max Fried. They got some answers there. They still have MVP type players, Matt Olson, Austin Riley, guys that can step up and elevate their game. Yeah, it's an embarrassment of riches that you're able to endure this, and actually it's not a lost season. Because I'd say 9 times out of 10, that team is done for the year. If you lose your best pitcher, your best hitter, like, come on, it's a wrap.
Yeah, you have to think that about 20 teams in baseball, if not more, be curious to kind of crunch those numbers, that if they lost their 2 best players, right? Whether it was, your best hitter and best pitcher, or you just pick your best 2, you take those guys off the roster, and are you going to make the postseason, right? Or does that seriously diminish? We also know that there's probably 5 or 6 teams before the season started that really didn't have a shot to begin with. So that being said, those teams that are kind of in the middle, you can point at yourself too if you want.
I'm like, I didn't get it on also camera, Mets. But yeah.
Also Mets. But yeah, you take those guys off, and you're like, we're kind of done, or man, maybe we could sneak in with the final wild card. But Atlanta's going to be okay. I mean, they have the 3rd best record in the National League, right? They got the top wild card, 10 games above 500. So they got themselves a nice cushion. And again, yeah, they're going to be okay. They're just not going to be wonderful like if they would have Ronald Acuna Jr. or Spencer Strider.
It's I'm now even thinking like it's partly due to the equity that the Braves have built. But if I told you Zach Wheeler and Bryce Harper go down tomorrow, how do we view the Phillies? Will we view them still like top tier team? I mean, I'd say definitely still a playoff team, but I think we would look at their world. I think their World Series odds would take a bigger hit than the Braves have probably taken, like in Vegas right now with those 2 guys going out, just because it's the Braves and they just find their way every year to the playoffs. And I still wouldn't completely count them out of this division either. Like we're saying the Phillies are the favorites, but the Braves still could turn it on. I'm not saying for sure it's a slam dunk case that the Phillies are absolutely going to win this division. I just think it's clearly what we'd expect at this point.
And as you said, the Phillies have had an easier route. Like, again, you can only beat who's in front of you, but how much can that, twist things just a little bit, where the Phillies are now playing more teams above 500. Atlanta has yet to play the Rockies. So there you go. Right there. You got 6 games against them. I imagine the Marlins too. There's a lot of games left with them, maybe more so than with the Phillies. So anything can happen. It's just the odds of Atlanta making up that gap and possibly coming back in the NL East to make up for the 6-game difference is probably, really small, but never say never.
Never say never. And honestly, too, the Phillies, they might have a bigger thing to play for. They're on pace when it comes to just having one of the best seasons ever. So if they are on that track and they keep maintaining that, it could get to the point where the Braves aren't even looking at the Phillies at some point this season. It's just, let's keep our guys healthy. Let's make sure we hold on to our wild card spot, and then we'll see a new season start in October, which could be a lot of fun. Will be a lot of fun. Speaking of 100-win paces, the Guardians and the Royals right now, from our favorite division, the AL Central, are both on a 100-win pace. Pretty unbelievable. In the history of these franchises, the Royals have done it once, 1977. The Guardians 3 times, the last time being 2017. But to see these two teams, where at the beginning of the season we thought, all right, this is the division that's wide open and 90 wins might just win it. Now you're looking at 2 teams that I think are starting to not only just pull away from the pack in the Central, 2 teams that are looking like top tier in the American League in general. These teams have been legit this season.
It's been incredible watching them, and very fun as well, of course, as we've been talking about all season long, in a division that, we expected to be competitive other than the White Sox. And for the most part, it is. I mean, Tigers are the 4th place team, and they're only 1 game under 500. So everyone in this division is doing well. It's not as if the Guardians and Royals are just beating up on the same teams 19 times in a season. So they're going out there, and whoever you line up in front of them, they're playing really well. They're pitching really well, which is the key part. You got to be doing everything really well. And I think with a younger group of guys for the Guardians, and maybe less so for the Royals, right? Because they've got some of those older vets with Salvador Perez, and in the rotation with Michael Wacha and Seth Lugo. But it's been refreshing, really, to have other teams to talk about. Like I could talk about the Dodgers, Yankees all day long. It's baseball, right? Like you shouldn't be impacted by hearing or seeing the same teams over and over again. I think if you're a true fan in many ways, not to be disparaging in any way, but it's baseball. So like, give me the best and I'll talk about the best and I'll watch the best gladly. But when you have organically 2 teams like the Guardians and Royals doing it this way, playing amazing baseball, 2 of the best teams in the American League, it's icing on the cake. And it's like you want that to happen, and it virtually never does. So we definitely need to cherish that at this point in the season, and think, you know what, maybe it can actually last a little bit longer than the first 2 months.
Once you reach Memorial Day, which we are recording on Memorial Day, that's when you start to say, all right, like, we got to take the sample that's in front of us and really value it, because it's now you're past the quarter mark of the season. You're really into it. And these teams aren't going anywhere. If anything, they're just continuing to double down, triple down, show us that they really are legit. And you look at a team like the Royals, or even, the Guardians here, they are doing it with great pitching, solid defense, and then this combination of there's some veterans, but a lot of youth and a lot of guys that are sort of performing more than you would expect. You look at Michael Garcia for the Royals right now, 33 runs driven in, playing great defense. He swiped 13 bases, like really solid numbers. He was good last year too, but just really good production. You see David Fry with the Guardians, who I can look at some of the expected data and some of the stuff under the surface that I tell you he's got a little bit lucky this year, but production's production, and he's coming through with big hits and a lot of big moments. So when you're seeing these underrated guys who don't really have names yet in the league establish themselves and be part of a team that is winning, that's about as fun of baseball as you can watch. And I talked about it on our last show. Like when I saw the Guardians firsthand for a series, I'm like, that team is just good. Like they're just, they get, when they get their opportunities, they capitalize on them. And you see teams that know how to win those games that are close, and the teams that find the ways to lose. And these are teams that are more often than not finding that way to win.
It really is an intangible quality to have that little bit of extra, right? It's like you go back and look at the Phillies, where excuse me, not the Phillies, the Padres. I think in 2022, right, where they lost all of these like 1-run games and they just couldn't win them, and that was there definitely is something to that, and they're getting that production too out of players that you can rely on, franchise cornerstones.
Yeah.
Like, as you said, with Mako Garcia, with 35 or so RBI, tied for 11th most in the American League. Like, a lot of people probably haven't heard of that name, but you need to know he's at third base there for KC. And then Jose Ramirez, who everybody does know, 53 RBI, and we're not even through the month of May. He leads the majors. So he's just been amazing. Guardians on an 8-game winning streak, although they are playing at Coors Field. So, shoot, are they going to get swept? No, probably not. But still, they could lose that series, because anytime you play a team at Coors Field, you got to be careful. But Guardians and Royals, breath of fresh air, and it's been fun to see so many of these players kind of step up and just passing the torch. That's all it really is, passing the baton to the next guy, where you don't need to be a superstar and hit those 5-run home runs with the bases empty, right? It's just, hey, look, do your job, and then the next guy after you is going to do it. That's why when you watch the highlights, it's somebody new almost each and every day, not just their Jose Ramirez and Bobby Witt Juniors.
Yeah, you have right now on the Guardians 4 guys who have got an F4 of pretty much 1.5 or more. Andres Gimenez at 1.4, David Fry at 1.5, J Ram at 1.7, and Stephen Kwan at 1.9 in 32 games, because he's hitting 350 with 407 on base. It's a joy. And you see the MVP candidates coming through for both these teams, and Jose Ramirez and Bobby Witt Jr. That's obviously a big driver on any 100-win team, which leads me to asking you the question, what do you think here? One of them gets to 100, both of them get to 100, and if you had to pick one of the two to get there, which of these teams do you think can actually pull it off? Because, again, I talked about the history. As great as they are right now, there's every chance that we're looking at 2 95-win teams, right, that don't actually get there. To get to that 100-win threshold is really special. So who do you think does it?
This is definitely tough, and I don't think it's just the standings showing me that the Guardians have 2.5 more wins, but Cleveland is one of those teams, like Tampa, those small market clubs where they always find a way to get it done. I think a lot of times when you get a new manager in there, either that's just to change up the culture, whatever it could be, that injects this life into an organization. I think Stephen Vogt has done that in Cleveland. So I'm tending to think that the Guardians are going to be the ones that are legit and will be able to stick around and for the first time since, as you said, 2017, win 100 games. I'm tending to think the Guardians are the ones that are going to pull that off. And look, if these two teams were in different divisions, I'd like my money on both of them. But AL Central is a little bit more difficult, and they got to play each other still several more times. So I'm leaning towards the Guardians over the Royals right now. How about you? Are you also going Guardians, or do you actually think the Royals can kind of make up that 2.5 game difference and get to the 100 mark first?
As much as it would be better content for me to say, oh, the Royals, we go back and forth and argue, I'm right there with you, because to me, the big differentiating factor that I believe will lead to the Guardians getting to 100 or being the better team in this division when the season ends, it comes down to the bullpen. We've talked about it before, but I still don't have complete faith in that Royals bullpen to be able to hold on to all the close games. The Guardians probably have the best bullpen in baseball, and Emmanuel Clase is back to being arguably the best closer in baseball. And I watched him pitch on 3 consecutive games and get 3 saves. And you just don't see that, guys that are going not just back-to-backs, but back-to-back-to-back and getting the job done and looking fresh in his 3rd appearance in that many days. So when you have a closer that good and you have a team that's constantly pushing across that run late to give yourself that 1-run lead, and that's all you need when you can shorten the game to 8 innings. And with the Guardians, with the bullpen they have, sometimes they can shorten it to 7 or 6 innings where they just you got to get to the final 9 outs for Cleveland, and you're going to be able to get the job done most times. I think that is really that secret sauce that separates the 95 win teams to the 100 win teams. The teams that can lock down all of those leads, those are the ones that get the job done.
As you said, with Clase right now, looking at Fangraphs wins above replacement, only Mason Miller is higher than Clase right now. So he's the second best reliever in all baseball, according to that statistic, or rather the American League. But then you go down the list, 5th in FWAR in the American League, Hunter Gaddis, their setup man. Their 7th inning guy, Kate Smith, is 6th in all of the American League. So
Crazy.
Half of the top 6 relievers right now, according to FWAR, pitch for the Cleveland Guardians. And then you go down the list, number 19, Tim Herron is also there. So 4 guys in the top 20, that are pretty elite right now. You're right. Like that's a huge component. And if you can go out and know that, look, you're going to be safe in the latter part of the inning, that allows your pitching to hold the score and allows your offense that many more bites at the apple to come from behind if you're not already in the lead.
I wonder just if I don't know if it's a renaissance of the closer, but there's something to be said about the value of a good closer. And comparing these two teams, head to head, James McArthur is sort of the de facto guy there. He's sit with a 3.8 ERA and a WHIP of 1.3. Clase's got a 0.33 ERA. It's not even close, and it just shows the difference. But I'm also even looking at, sort of as we stretch beyond these two teams, Ryan Helsley has 17 saves. And how many wins do the Cardinals even have this year? Like that alone is mind-boggling, because he's probably saved, 2/3 of their victories? I have to look. Are they at like 25 wins right now? Something like that? Yeah, they're 25 and 26. And he's got 17 saves. So the closer role, I mean, you see even the reason the A's have been able to have a much better season up to this point than we would have expected is because of Mason Miller. So there is something to be said about having that guy in the 9th inning that is going to get the job done.
It's true. Yeah, it just shortens a game. That's what everyone used to say when you played the Yankees is, look, you're getting 24 outs. And there's a lot of times where he would go 2 innings. So that's 21 outs that you got to get, and the game's over at that point. So those players have that value. And, the metrics that we use with wins above replacement don't put the same value on it as teams do, because we see how much money closers and top relievers get, despite the fact that they're throwing a fraction of the innings as even a decent starting pitcher. Yet, again, if you have guaranteed outs there, that's how you get the job done, right? I think I don't know if they showed this in the film Moneyball, but in the book by Michael Lewis, they're basically saying, hey, we need to score this many runs in order to have X amount of wins, right? They just broke it down that way. And so they're grabbing guys with on base percentage, that are undervalued and things of that nature. And if, again, 27 outs is used to be the only clock, if you will, used to be the only thing you would time in baseball, if you will, or measure a game by. If you can shorten that to 24, 21, or in the case of the Cleveland Guardians, 18 outs on a night in, night out basis, yeah, you are going to have one of the best records in all of baseball.
It really does just make things so much easier on a team. And I on the Foul Territory podcast, I heard them talking about, like, what's more valuable, the ace or the lockdown closer. And you have former players on the show, and they were just talking about that mental advantage it gives you as a team, just knowing that, hey, you get a lead, it's huge. And on the other side of it, if you're playing down and you know that Clase is waiting in the 9th, you feel like you press a little bit as a hitter in those late innings in the 6th, 7th, and 8th, which maybe helps those other guys below Clase be so dominant because they're going against a team that's maybe gripping the bat a little bit tighter. So it really is an interesting discussion about the value of a closer. And that's why when we eventually get to the trade deadline, when you look at a guy like Mason Miller that might be out there, or a guy like Ryan Helsley that might be out there, that's where those relief pitchers get so much more, not only in contracts, but also when they're traded, because there's just an inherent extra value you got to put on the guys that have been battle tested in that 9th inning, getting the final 3 outs.
I certainly had never thought of it in that capacity with, hey, this guy is pitching the 9th inning, so here's our opportunity. It's almost the same thing when you have someone like Shohei Ohtani or Freddie Freeman, whatever, protecting you in the lineup. You're going to see better pitches because they're worried about the guy behind you, right? So they need to get you out in some shape or form. So they don't want to walk you. So they're going to give you some more opportunities for better or worse. And so I'd never thought of it in that way of like, hey, the guy in the ninth is almost protecting the guy in the eighth because he's so dominant. So that very well could be the case, for these guys that, Emmanuel Clase is the dude right now. He's definitely on that Hall of Fame path. But, we also said that about Francisco Rodriguez way back when, and he's still waiting for the call. So we'll see.
Yeah, you got to really put it together when it comes to a career to get to the Hall of Fame as a closer. But those guys are truly special. Can we just open up a little side wing? If we're not going to put them in, like, let's just, put a shed out to the side. The best relievers, just put it somewhere. Give us an exhibit.
No, it's the back door, right?
Back door.
You close the door on your way out.
There you go.
The names of all the little players.
There you go.
Right?
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, okay.
Maybe just like put their names like in the path, engrave it in the cobblestone and just
on the way to the exit with
exactly.
The door closed. You're like, oh, Armando Benitez, look at that. Oh, John Franco finally is being acknowledged.
You just threw some former Mets at me to put a smile on my face, didn't you? Armando Benitez.
You know it.
Good stuff. Braden Looper, how about that? All right,
Loop the poop. Okay.
All right. Let's switch gears here. We're almost at June, so we can start to talk a little bit of trade deadline stuff. I want to go through 3 teams that I find really interesting right now. Teams that went into this season with the intention of trying to win. So we're not looking at the White Sox or the A's that we expect to sell. 3 teams that hoped to be able to win this year that are on the verge of blowing it up. That's the Blue Jays, my Mets, and the Cardinals. And I want to start with the Cardinals because they've won 5 in a row and they just swept the Orioles. So let's start there. Are the Cardinals a team that we're starting to buy into to get themselves out of that sell conversation? Because I think the last thing they want to do among these 3 teams, I think they're the one that will be the easiest to talk themselves into. We got a shot this year. The division is still pretty open. The NL wild card is wide open. So are we buying into the Cardinals right now not being one of these teams that's at risk of having to blow it up?
I think the Cardinals are probably that safest pick for right now because they're surging, because we know the investments that they've made in these players and how their window of contention is probably on the shorter side, at least for their marquee players with Nolan Arenado, Paul Goldschmidt, all getting older. Sonny Gray still has a few more years, but he's getting up there in age. Same with Miles Mikolas, Kyle Gibson, Lance Lynn. They got a young group of guys that are on the come up, but you know what? Some of these older players with expiring contracts, they've got to make a decision where they go all in to try to make the most of this opportunity in an NL Central that's still incredibly winnable. Cubs and Brewers seem like they got off to a really solid start. Cubs are in the midst of a 4-game losing streak, but Cardinals, after how bad they were to start the year, are only 4.5 games back of the Brewers, and Brewers are the only team that actually have a positive run differential. So, I think this is coming probably at a great time for the Cardinals because, I think you could have seen maybe John Mozeliak be a little bit aggressive and make moves like that. Certainly out of the ordinary, but that's because the Cardinals are always ahead of the pack. They're always in the hunt for a postseason spot, but it does seem like they don't have the right pieces right now to get it done. And so an aggressive trade in late May or early June would have maybe revitalized some things in St. Louis. Now that's off the table because they've shown that they can win. They can beat a top team like the Baltimore Orioles, who I believe they certainly were the longest active team that hadn't gotten swept. But I don't know if it was just the longest active streak without getting swept in the history of baseball. Bottom line is you're beating 3 in a row. The Orioles 3 in a row. You got a good ball club on your hands.
You do. Yeah. The funny thing about that was that the Orioles were swept in the playoffs last year. But when it came to the regular season, it was a couple years. I think it was pretty much since Adley Rutschman had been promoted that they hadn't been swept essentially. So yeah, that really has to give them a lot of confidence. And they're interesting because I can make an argument that for the betterment of their team in the future, Goldschmidt's going to be a free agent after this year. That's a guy that if you were to float him at the deadline, maybe you ate the contract down a little bit, you might be able to get a nice piece. And Ryan Helsley, like I mentioned, the season he's having, the volatility of relievers, if you can cash in on a year and a half left of Helsley's control and make the move a la Josh Hader from a couple years ago, that could be huge for you. I mean, we're going to have an article coming up at Just Baseball soon here about that Josh Hader trade, because it ended up getting them William Contreras, which makes it one of the best trades that has been made in the last 5 years, that you turned a year and a half of Josh Hader into a catcher that now looks like one of, if not the best catcher in all of baseball. So for the Cardinals, that's the difficult balance that they're going to have to try to pull here. What do you do? Do you believe in this team? Do you believe that you're going to get to the playoffs and then a rotation of Sonny Gray, Lance Lynn, and Kyle Gibson is enough to make it through the playoffs? Like, how much are you buying into the team? Do you just sit on your hands and say, all right, we're just going to let this thing play out, which I think is the most likely scenario. But if you do that, do you have enough to even make noise if you get there? So it feels like you're sort of damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, because I feel like you have to add to this team if you're going to make a legitimate run. But are you adding to a team that just doesn't have enough to actually, make it all the way through? So I think the Cardinals, in a weird way, they're in the best and the worst spot of these three teams that we're talking about today.
Yeah, of the three that we're talking about, absolutely. And it's what's hard too is because there are other clubs that they've got players that are locked up kind of long term, or they're on the younger side. And you say, well, you know what, this just isn't our time right now. Like, you look at the Arizona Diamondbacks and say, well, if they can't figure it out, they're okay, right? They don't necessarily need to blow anything up, and they might not have as many pieces to trade. Whereas, as you pointed out, Ryan Helsley, only a year and a half left until he hits free agency. They've got a lot of guys that are on a club option deal for next year. So, the veteran pitchers, Kyle Gibson, he has a club option. Steven Matz, he signed through 2025. Lance Lynn, club option. Even someone like Tommy Edman, which he seems still incredibly young, right? 29 years old, but he only has a year and a half left until he becomes a free agent. So you have all of these guys that, you could dangle out there and get a little bit more. Even Miles Michaelis, a guy who's made his name as a St. Louis Cardinal, he's a free agent after the 2025 campaign. So they could really, blow things up in a big way and really help the guys out that are going to still be around. But right now they are in that no man's land, like you said, for better or worse. They really just have to wait this thing out and kind of re-examine things in the next month, rather than be aggressive and start making those moves and getting a little bit extra because, hey, if we acquire this guy now, we'll give you a little bit more because that's an extra month he's on my team and not yours. They're probably going to have to wait until, Independence Day, if you will, before they make a decision. Is this the team that we're going to stick with? Is this the team we're going to stick with and then add to? Or do we need to just start shipping off a couple pieces here and there?
Yeah, it's a really tough tightrope to walk, especially when you are a franchise like the Cardinals that's expected to make the playoffs each year. That always makes it a little bit harder to sell to a fan base. If they're sitting at 2 games out of the wild card at the deadline, even if it's the responsible thing to do for their franchise to cash in a chip like Helsley, we saw that went over with a smaller market team in the Brewers. It didn't go over well. The Cardinals, that'd be even a tougher sell to the fans. So it's going to be a team to monitor, where you would hope, I think, if you're John Mozeliak, that it's either you're like right at the top of the wild card standings when you get there, or you fall out of it to a point where it's easy to say, look, we have to pull it back because this isn't our year. This is where I will now sell you on the New York Mets being in the best position of these 3 teams, because they're not really committed to most of the guys that could be dangled. The toughest one to talk about selling is Pete Alonso. But another article I think I'm actually be writing this week here is, were the New York Mets built to sell this year? Because they signed a bunch of guys on 1-year deals, and you're looking at what they could do at this deadline. And I guess I'm turning into a prospect hugger. I'm getting excited because Luis Severino, I mean, there's a chance this guy is the best rental pitcher available at this year's deadline. He has looked fantastic so far. They're keeping a 6-man rotation, so he's throwing once a week. Probably keep him fresh until the deadline, potentially make him look as attractive as possible. You have Sean Manaea, similar boat, not quite the performance, but you could get something there. You have JD Martinez signed to a contract that has a bunch of deferred money. It only costs $2.5 million this year. So for any team that wants a just right-handed proven run producer on a cheap contract, the Mets could ship him out. And I think they're in a position where if they have a miraculous run before this deadline and they get into the race, they're fine to keep them. But if not, I mean, they're going to have a ton to sell. And that window that Max Scherzer was talking about, 25, 26, that might have actually been the exact vision for the Mets.
The Mets have 13 players that are going to be free agents next year. 14 if you count Jake Diekman, who needs a certain qualifier, right, to come back on the mutual option. And then Sean Manaea is the only one that's going to be a free agent after 2025. So he's probably in that mix. That's 15 guys that you could look and play around with and dangle as these trade chips. So yeah, they've got their core guys. They got the Nimos and McNeil's. Yes, Jeff McNeil is kind of a core player for the Mets right now. Lindor, Kodai Senga. But other than that, who are those players? They've got some of the young ones that are in the system. We're seeing Brett Beatty now kind of start to make his Mets memories and things of that nature. But look, yeah, they're going to be able to trade off and then save some money too on the back end, right? Where they can save that money and potentially towards next year's. You can only save so much when you're paying the Texas Rangers and Houston Astros, right, for Scherzer and Verlander.
Here's the interesting part about it. I think Steve Cohen loves what they did at the deadline last year. I think if the Mets were to go into sell mode again, he would once again try to use his money to get better prospect returns. So I can even see, like, you're looking at Starling Marte and you're saying right now he's been about a league average player, not too great. But if there's a team, I don't know if they'd send him to the Braves, but let's just say a team in desperate need of a corner outfielder, and yes, he's got 2 years left, but the Mets made it a super palatable contract where they eat. I think he's making like 19 a season. If they ate the remainder of his contract in like 15 million of the contract next year, all of a sudden that's a piece that can be moved. Jeff McNeil, similar boat where it's a couple years after this year, I think maybe 2 years after. That one I think would be a little bit harder to swallow, but the point is the Mets can eat down these contracts. Even Severino, like, he's pitched great, and I think any team would be willing to pay his $13 million, the prorated amount of it. But if you got an extra prospect for throwing whatever the millions of dollars into it, and you can send it to a team that might be up against, like if you send them to the Padres, for example, and they're pinching pennies, like that's the mode the Mets are in right now. It is a lot of a whole new type of money ball, and it's not saving, it's spending. I think the Mets are almost in a position where no one would want to tell you it, but I think they're very comfortable being sellers again. And right now they're letting this team play it out and see what happens. But I think there's a very strong possibility they're the most aggressive seller again.
How about billionaire ball?
Billionaire ball, yeah.
That the way? Because look, a money ball was about finding value where other teams didn't in order to save money. Whereas the Mets are using money as an asset. And look, if they're able to do that, so be it. So Uncle Steve is like you said, paying down these deals to get better players. And it certainly worked out really well with Luis Angel Acuna, the one Acuna that will be playing in the NL East somewhere, even if it is in the minors right now. So yeah, you're right. Like, that is an asset that they can totally utilize to buy down these contracts and then still bring in more contracts next year. It's amazing how some like small market teams don't try to utilize a strategy like that in a sense. Because I've seen the Dodgers do that in the past where, when they acquired Homer Bailey, basically saying, hey, we'll take this bad contract from the Reds. And then they end up getting, I think it was Josiah Gray and Jeter Downs from the Reds in that deal. And then they turn around, trade Jeter Downs in the deal that gets the Mookie Betts. And Josiah Gray goes over to the Nationals for Trey Turner and Max Scherzer. So like, you can utilize money as an asset in that way. And for smaller teams, if they want to go ahead and take a bad contract, they might get a better prospect. In the case of the Mets, they give a bad contract, but then they pay even more of it down. Now they are going to be the ones who benefit from that prospect. And like Max said, 25, 26, 27 really becomes where the Mets are eyeing true contention rather than 24.
It's a very NBA philosophy because we see it happen in the NBA all the time. These expiring contracts, the bad teams take them on, or teams who are trying to get an expiring contract to free up money for free agency. Money is played with a lot more in that sport, but we're starting to see it be a little bit more in vogue in baseball. To see the Marlins eat money on Luis Ariz to get better prospects, that was pretty surprising, but it shows you where we might be moving here, where if a team has a payroll that they're comfortable with and they're in a seller position and there's another team that's pushing up against those really dangerous luxury tax thresholds, that's where you can find some value. It's funny you mentioned Moneyball was finding value where other teams didn't. I think the Mets are finding value where other teams can't, because most teams can't swallow this amount of money. The Mets clearly with Steve Cohen can, which brings us though to our final team of this group here, which is the Blue Jays, which I think is the most fascinating one. We're almost pushing up on an hour recording here, so let's sit up on our seats and try not to spend too much time in the Blue Jays, because honestly, I don't know what they do. They are falling out of the race fast. And we were talking about this on an editors meeting today. Like they were saying, Ross Atkins, like, is he going to sell? When if he sells, he might be out of a job. That's when you get to that point with the GM. That's the other thing about the Mets. David Stearns just got here. He's got no worries about that. You have a GM in a tenuous spot with a team that has maybe a year or two left of this window. They could blow it up and they could reset their farm. They could trade Vladdy. They could trade Bo Bichette. They could even trade Kevin Gausman, who's under a great contract and would be the best pitcher dealt at this deadline if they wanted to. But will they do it? That's the toughest one to figure out, I think.
Anytime that you have superstar players to trade, because we got to discuss Bo Bichette and Vladimir Guerrero Jr., free agents this time in 15 months, right?
Yeah.
At the end of 2025, you want the next general manager to be the one in place to say, hey, we've got this trade chip and we're going to be bringing back a lot. Well, I would like to have a say as to what we bring back, because if the guy before me got a bunch of pieces, I don't like any of these. I think that was a bad trade. So
yeah.
you want that new guy to be in place, which leads me to believe that Atkins is probably going to be around, and it is going to be his decision to figure out what's going to go on. Now, I think because you still have Bichette and Vlad Guerrero Jr. in 2025, you probably still have money to at least extend one of those players after that. You want to roll this thing back. Now, you could tap out for this year in hopes of getting a 2 out of 3, right? And being better in 2025. Like you said, Gausman could be one of those guys. I think Chris Bassett might even be a better option, as he's a player who's a free agent after 2025. So again, it's a year plus of him. Chad Green, once he comes off the IL, maybe you're able to get something for him. Isaiah Kiner-Falefa. These are the kind of players where they're not free agents after this year. It's a little bit further down the line. Justin Turner and Yusei Kikuchi are free agents after this year.
Yeah.
So since they're not going to be back next year, you can go ahead and get something for nothing, if you will. And it still allows you to contend and be relevant in 2025 with Bo and Vlad. And so I don't know, maybe that's like the safest bet, is to have smaller subtractions this year. Not to say that Yusei Kikuchi and Chris Bassett, these are smaller guys. They're just guys that are going to be gone sooner than later. It could allow you to have another bite at the apple in 2025.
I'm remembering back to when Trey Turner was traded, because if I recall correctly, no one saw that one coming. I mean, we thought, okay, Scherzer's going to be a free agent. They might deal him. But when Trey Turner was included, it was like they just traded Trey Turner because they still had him under control for another year. I think like Bo Bichette getting dealt at this deadline would send that level of shockwaves. And I don't know which team would be the one that would step up to acquire. Maybe it is the Dodgers again, that are the team that just does it, because they certainly could, move Mookie back to second base, wherever they wanted to put him. They could make it work. But that's the guy that I'm curious about the most, because I feel like he's the one that they'd either extend or they'd really want to make sure they got value out of. With Vladdy, I just don't know what the value of a first baseman is. Like that's the constant debate I'm having on my show with people talking about Pete Alonso getting traded. Is I'm like, I don't know if you get anything more than the value of extending him the qualifying offer and getting a pick. Like I really don't know. So Bo Bichette is the really curious case I have when it comes to the Blue Jays and just what they do in general. I do agree, though. Probably the happy middle ground that they find is trading off a piece like Kikuchi, who's going to be a free agent. If Justin Turner can hit a little bit better before the deadline, he's another guy. But yeah, it's a weird place the Blue Jays are in. I think the Blue Jays and the Cardinals are caught in this in between. when we look at these three teams that we talked about. The Mets are the one that is just like, yeah, they're probably just going to sell. There's probably not much of a middle ground.
I would agree with Bichette playing the more premium position at shortstop.
Yeah.
There are defensive questions about Vlad Guerrero Jr. And I can remember back when Ryan Howard got his second extension from the Phillies when it wasn't necessary. And everyone recognized like this guy is probably not going to age very well. And so they overextended that extension in a big way. And one of the indicators that I like to look at on Baseball Reference is similar batters, right? And you can kind of say who's in a guy's class, like who are other players that have put these numbers up at a certain age. And if you look at the top 10 of this player, you tell me if this is a superstar worth trading major prospects for. And again, this is only one indicator, right? Only one metric, if you will. Geronimo Barroa, Luke Easter, Brad Fulmer, Willie Aikens, Cal Daniels, Rhys Hoskins, Luke Scott, Uriel Durazo, Christian Walker, and Brian Roberts. Okay, those last two are pretty good. Those are the 10 most similar batters through age 26 for Vlad Guerrero Jr.
Wow.
Is this going to be a superstar-like player? Is this going to be like a Prince Fielder type, right? A second-generation slugging first baseman? And he very well could, but there are a lot of indicators to suggest that, there's a lot of flash with the home run. He's got a big name recognition, but there's issues with defense at first base. And when he's bad, he looks bad. You probably want to link yourself to a different second generation guy in Bo Bichette versus Vlad Guerrero Jr.
It's interesting because how much does the name change our view of the player? Because I think that certainly has been the case with Vladdy, because it's literally the same name. It's not like Bo Bichette and Dante Bichette. And it's also, when it comes to the fathers, you had a Hall of Famer with one of them. And he's had his moments, the home run derby and everything else. And, being right there with Ohtani for the MVP that one year. But yeah, I feel like we feel like there's more peaks and valleys with Vladdy, but when you kind of look at it and when you compare him to other hitters, maybe the values have been more pronounced. And so if you're talking about not only trading for Vladimir Guerrero Jr., but also the prospect of then extending or signing when he becomes a free agent, how many teams are going to be really excited to sign this guy to a 7-year deal when the back half of that contract can look horrible? You mentioned the Ryan Howard contract. I was also thinking of the Chris Davis contract in Baltimore. Like those first base contracts don't always age well. So yeah, they're in a really tough spot. So we'll see if the Blue Jays can turn it on. They certainly have the talent that this conversation completely shifts, and they might be buyers at the deadline. But they are a team that we have to watch. So that's going to be all for today's episode, though. I had a topic that we're gonna tease for next time because we went a little bit longer today. It was a great article we had on the site, so if you want to go and read it. The Nationals made the most of the Juan Soto trade. We're going to talk about that next time because the return they've had has been fantastic in Washington considering all the circumstances, and that story's not going anywhere. So we'll get to that on our next stream. We appreciate all of you who tuned in to watch live today. If you are either watching the follow-up on Twitter or on YouTube, make sure you head over to our YouTube channel to catch all the individual topics of the show. We break them up. You can also listen to the audio version of Who's Better Baseball wherever you get your podcast. You can find us on social media at Who's Better BB, and we'll be back with another stream later on this week or early next week.